Eyewitnesses to the assassination say that Dr. King left his room, 306, at the Lorraine Hotel just before dinner to get some air. He walked over to the railing at this spot, and noticing some friends below, he leaned over and began to speak with them. Police say 205 feet away, in a window in a flophouse, the assassin waited. He waited, police believe, in a bathroom down the hall from the room he rented but 4 hours earlier. To get a clear shot of his victim, the assassin apparently had to stand in the bathtub, leaning forward to brace his arms on the window ledge to steady his rifle. And this was the view he got. He fired a single shot, hitting his target squarely, and then he ran. Out of the bathroom and along the decrepit hallway, turning, he raced down the rickety wood stairs and out. One policeman said he simply faded. Ike Pappas, CBS News, Memphis.
Just at 8 this morning, Dr. Martin Luther King's body was brought to Lyon State for an hour. For some, the experience was just too much. The plane had come from Atlanta bearing Mrs. King. There were police and National Guardsmen at the airport with rifles and shotguns and riot sticks to hold back the crowd of newsmen and spectators. After some delay, the casket was placed aboard for the last journey home to Atlanta.
What's the emotion when you come back?
It's like pulling the scab off of a wound. It's just raw. It's not healed. It hurts. It's so wrong. He was so young and so strong. He had so much meaning, so much life left to live, so much more to give, and yet they just killed him. And our government did not protect him. Matter of fact, our government sought to disgrace and discredit him. Our government have set the climate for his being killed.
James Earl Ray, who was convicted of killing Dr. King, why have you said before you believe he didn't act alone?
He didn't have the money, the motive, or the organization skills to do it. A lone killer getting out of town at 6 o'clock, getting into Mississippi and all that, end up in London. He couldn't have done that by himself.
What do you think happened?
The government was very involved.
To what extent do you think J. Edgar Hoover played a role in...
I have no idea. That gets into too much detail, except I know this guy couldn't do it by himself. And there was a very public hatred for Dr. King expressed by the FBI and the government. So when we look at Dr. King's work, we say when he changed the law and changed the culture and changed our sense of self-belief. When we fall down, we get back up again because the ground is no place for champions. So champions keep fighting.
A reporter for the Mutual Broadcasting System, Andy West, was in the hallway, the kitchen hallway in the Ambassador Hotel last night when Senator Kennedy was shot. He is perhaps the man who was closest to the senator when the shots were fired.
So I thank all of you who made this possible this evening, all of the effort that you made, and all of the people whose names I haven't mentioned, but who did all of the work at the precinct level, who got out the vote, who did all of the effort, brought forth all of the effort that's required. I was a campaign manager 8 years ago. I know what a difference that kind of an effort and that kind of commitment makes. So I thank all of you, those of you who are here. Mayor Yorty has just sent me a message that we've been here too long already. So my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
What do you remember about the shooting, if you're willing to talk about that?
Obviously, I was there, but I don't remember the exact moment. I don't remember pulling my gun out of my body or whatever it was located, and I don't remember aiming at any human being. I don't remember any of that, and I've said that from the get-go.
Yeah, I understand.
It's not that I'm trying to evade.
No, I understand. Let me just ask you a question. When did you start remembering things after the shooting? What was the first thought that you had after the shooting?
Everything was always hazy in my head about that. And Tony Teeter, who passed away, was trying to get a specialist to hypnotize me and to regress me and to do all that.
But when did you start remembering things clearly after the shooting?
I really don't remember things clearly about it, other than that.
No, I'm not asking about the shooting part. I'm asking afterwards. When did you start remembering things in reality?
The reality of this whole thing hit me when I was on death row facing my own
So
death.
how many months later was that?
Oh, I would say maybe a year, 2 years.
So you don't remember a lot of things between the shooting and being on death
I
row?
wasn't too much worried about that, Mr. President. I was worried about saving my own butt from execution.
Hello, welcome to episode 81 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this is John Lennon in 1968, part 1, with Matt Williamson, who has the wonderful YouTube channel Pop Goes the 60s. Now, regular listeners will know how this goes. Part 1 of 2 is a kind of taster episode focusing on the year itself with world events, births and deaths, usually very brief, that section, as with today. Films, and then singles and albums which are non-Beatles and non-Lennon. And then part 2 is generally longer and focused on, obviously, John Lennon and the Beatles and the events of their year. The clip you just heard there was a compilation of a few clips pertaining to the 2 major assassinations of 1968. I'm not really going to comment on them now. I do briefly later, but it's too frustrating, to be honest, commenting about things like this and getting very predictable responses. Those who have their minds closed to things, they're probably going to remain closed, and those who have their minds open, they will probably want to research these things more thoroughly. So anyway, Matt and I recorded the 2 parts of this almost in one day, so a couple of times you might hear me refer to later when I'm talking about part 2. Before we go into it, I wanted to mention a book I'm currently reading. Fantastic book called The Pythons Autobiography by the Pythons. That's obviously referring to the Monty Python comedy group. It's a bit of a monster, this book. It's about 450 pages and about 2/3 of the way through it at this point. But it's very, very compelling. We reviewed Monty Python The Holy Grail, their fabulous film, recently on Film Gold. And of course, the Rutles were the bridge between Monty Python and the Beatles, obviously having Eric Idle as one of the main people. And George Harrison had a cameo in the film as well, of course. But I wanted to comment on the many other similarities between the Pythons and the Beatles. I knew some of these already, but reading this book, it's really quite amazing. So I'll go through a few of these. You have to sort of think of the Pythons as the rock stars of the comedy world, certainly in that late 60s to about the, late 70s period, really, with The Life of Brian in 1979. So let's just go through a few of these. So complex intergroup dynamics. Of course, that's common to many other groups, but if you take the Rolling Stones, for example, it seems that in the original incarnation, it was really Mick, Keith and Brian that had the complex relationships, and then, Wyman and Watts were at the back, and you never really heard much of any tension between them and the other members of the group. Whereas with the Pythons and with the Beatles, you had these 4 in the Beatles and 6 in the Pythons, very distinct and all pretty strong personalities working together. It's kind of a miracle, really. I always think that these kind of groups get anything done, really, and you can imagine, and I know from reading this book, the tensions that went into it and all the stress, but of course they're very happy with the end product. I thought it might be fun to do a sort of person-by-person comparison of the 2 groups. Let me preface by saying this doesn't really work, but it's just a fun indulgence for me, really. So I'd say John Cleese is the kind of John Lennon figure, the figure they generally looked up to, certainly at the start, literally with John Cleese because he's so tall, but also the person who seemed quite detached from the group and had quite a lot of edge to their personality, arguably more than the others in the group. Now, the Michael Palin, Terry Jones duo, let's call it, because they generally wrote together. If you don't know with the Pythons, by the way, generally John Cleese and Graham Chapman wrote together, Palin and Jones wrote together, Idle wrote on his own, and Terry Gilliam did the animation. So Palin and Jones I'd liken to Paul McCartney, perhaps they're the most likeable, generally the most industrious, because what I discovered in this book, in the latest seasons of the TV series, they tended to do more writing than the others. Eric Idle, I'd sort of ally with George Harrison. They were pretty good friends actually in the 70s, and Idle wrote alone, as did Harrison in the Beatles, while surrounded by a writing team, or 2 writing teams in the Pythons' case. And Terry Gilliam really is nothing like Ringo Starr, but just for the sake of filling this out, Gilliam's animations sort of bridge these quite disjointed sketches and made it some kind of whole. And I'd liken that to Ringo's fills and his overall drum work, kind of doing a similar thing. I mean, if you think of John Lennon's quite strange time signatures, they've all remarked about that. His songs had these weird signatures, such as All You Need Is Love, Good Morning, and other ones. If you think of that as an equivalent of anarchic and nonsensical Python sketches, then maybe Gilliam and Ringo were doing something of a similar job, kind of a glue to put it all together, let's say. And that leaves us with Graham Chapman, who the Pythons all say in this book was just simply a one-off, impossible to really know, and off with the fairies a lot of the time, especially in the years when he was an alcoholic. So anyway, yeah, that's my tenuous comparison. Hope you enjoyed that. But there are other similarities. So here's a few. The Pythons made albums, as in record albums, that were a little like the Beatles' Christmas fan club records, even down to the names, because there's, I think it's called the Monty Python album, then another Monty Python album, and the second Beatles Christmas record was called Another Beatles Christmas Record. The Pythons also made a song album called Monty Python Sings. They did live concerts, gigs, if you will, and the audience would shout out the lines just as they do with singing the lyrics when bands like the Beatles and other bands are doing concerts. I suppose in the Beatles days they didn't do that. They just literally just screamed the house down. Both groups played the Hollywood Bowl, and in fact on the film Monty Python at the Hollywood Bowl, which came out in the early 80s, you can actually see George Harrison with Olivia during the intermission. George was in one of his mustachioed periods. It's during the intermission where John Cleese is going along the aisles selling albatross, mocking the habit in the old days in cinemas of the ice cream lady going up and down the aisles selling ice cream during the interval. The Pythons also started their own company, as did the Beatles, and in this Python book they talk about the need to not get screwed and let the company descend into chaos. I can't imagine what that's referring to. They also talk about the problem of division of writing royalties, which again is something you associate with pop rock songwriters. The Beatles and the Pythons both made films, and I'd argue Magical Mystery Tour isn't a million miles away from the Python style. They both rejected an outside director and then did it themselves. In the Pythons' case, it was Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam co-directing the Holy Grail, and then Terry Jones doing Life of Brian on his own. The Pythons actually technically made 5 films, but I would discount And Now for Something Completely Different, because that was a compilation of sketches. Live at the Hollywood Bowl was like a live album, if you will. And then Meaning of Life was kind of just sketches put together as well. So if you don't know Monty Python very well, I would point you directly to Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Monty Python's Life of Brian as 2 fantastic films. The Holy Grail film was partly funded by rock bands, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd and Genesis. They actually contributed between them about half of the financing. You know, these things get reported wrongly, and it was reported that, you know, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd paid for the whole film, which wasn't true. However, I believe George Harrison did pay for all of Life of Brian, and quite a funny reference to leave you with. Elvis Presley was apparently a Python fan and would call people squire after the famous Nudge Nudge Wink Wink sketch, one of Python's most famous sketches from the TV series. And he would also quote Holy Grail lines in his latter years as well. Elvis, of course, tragically didn't live to see the Life of Brian in 1979, but there you go. There are actually other similarities, but I think that's enough for now because we want to get to the episode. Just finally, if you'd like to help out the show, you can do that monetarily through the Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes. There's also a PayPal link on the SoundCloud homepage, or you can leave a rating or review, or simply just spread the word and share links to the show with others. In terms of keeping up with the occasional video episodes or other links and posts that aren't in the audio feed, the Twitter page is probably the best place, and the handle is @OnionLennon, capital O, capital L. There's no outro to this episode. I'll now cut to myself and Matt Williamson back in late May when we recorded this, and I'll see you next month for John Lennon in 1968, Part 2. So all the best and enjoy the episode. Hello everybody, this is Glass Onion on John Lennon, and I'm very happy to have with me today someone making their both first and second appearance on Glass Onion. I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Matt Williamson from Pop Goes the 60s. How are you, mate?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Antony.
Excellent. Let me explain. I was on your show last year and you kindly let me use the audio for a bonus episode, so you have kind of been on the podcast already, but this is the first time we've actually sat down and recorded. And we also did for your show Get Back as well, and I might want to use the audio. My fictitious lawyer will be in touch. We'll negotiate. So I'll stop talking rubbish now. Can you introduce your channel to us, please?
Sure. My name is Matt Williamson, and I do the Pop Goes the 60s YouTube channel. And that channel is basically, well, what the title says. It's everything 1960s, mostly music with a focus on the Beatles. I do some pop culture stuff as well, some film stuff, but mainly it's uncovering music bands of the 60s and playing some of their music and talking about their histories.
Okay, and as of now, because we're recording this at the end of May, but it's probably going out in July, you've just done the Byrds. So what other 60s bands have you covered other than the Beatles? Just give us a couple.
Well, the Byrds was a 4-part series I just completed that was rather long. It's about 26 minutes per video, and I didn't intend for them to be that long, but you know how it goes. You start getting... Histories are not easy to tell. I mean, it takes the time it takes. So I've done them. I've done The Love and Spoonful. I've done Spanky and Our Gang. I've done The Association. I've done some more obscure bands like the Nazz, The Creation, The Kaleidoscope, Marianne Faithfull. So I'm running the gamut, and I've got plenty more to come.
Excellent, yeah. Talking about history, you and I know, because we're both in the kind of Beatles community, the Beatles' history is ever-changing. Even though the events happened however long ago, they're always changing, and we're actually going to get into part of that today, courtesy of Chip Madinger, who's been on the show already, and his amazing book, Lennonology. Anyway, we'll get to that. So we are going to be tackling John Lennon in 1968, but listeners who've heard this series, they will know that a good, sometimes half of the episode, sometimes slightly less, goes on the actual year itself, because I like to set the scene, probably set the scene a little bit excessively, to be honest, but that's what we do here, you know, we branch out. And I guess there's one point I wanted to make, really, off the bat. Mainstream history always tends to simplify things. And history tells us that 1967 was peace and love, and then 1968 was very tumultuous, and there was a lot of violence. Now, the second one of those is correct, of course. But if you actually look closely at 67, during the quote-unquote Summer of Love, there were, I think, up to 100 race riots around the US. And obviously Vietnam was going on, and, you know, there were no flowers and bells in Vietnam. However, I do believe the hippie ideal was sincere. I think Haight-Ashbury, we were talking about this another time, and almost actually burned itself out by 67, funnily enough. And you know how these things go. The peak of a movement is usually before it goes mainstream and gets commercialized. But anyway, what do you make of 67? I know we're talking about 68, but just very quickly, just to set the scene, how much of that do you feel was genuine?
Well, I agree with what you said. Like, when people, from a pop culture standpoint, at least in America, talk about 67, they talk about the Summer of Love, and that was really the Monterey Pop Festival, which was early June 1967. That was the, I guess, the pinnacle or the high point, and that's when the media started, it gave the media something to focus on. So everything leading up to that point, from, I would say, even the summer of 65, was really the golden era that was experienced more by the underground. Well, it wasn't above ground, it wasn't just underground, but it was clubs sprouting up, bands forming, all the embryonic beginnings of these bands. By mid-67, right around when Monterey happened, Sgt. Pepper was released, but after that point, and in England you also had the bust of Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, which was a big deal. All those things kind of were the end of the peace and love, and things got more guarded, darker, and we didn't see that much in 67, but we certainly saw it in 68.
Yes, and then we just, funnily enough, the last one of these years we did on the show was 69, so we've gone back one year, and of course Altamont happened amazingly symbolically December 69, of course, didn't it? Anyway, we've covered that before, but 68 really is quite a remarkable year. I mean, we've both been doing a bit of research here, and in all these shows I've been doing about certain years, there's two parallel universes, if you will. These years I've been doing are tended to get dominated by Vietnam, and the Beatles' story and psychodrama, and particularly the John Lennon psychodrama, it seems trivial when you're actually talking about death and destruction. Obviously, you know, there was some death in the Beatles family, you know, Epstein in 67, but it's interesting to have these two parallel worlds where the Beatles world is very dramatic and important within its own universe. There is some wider significance, yes, but it's just very interesting to have those two parallel things going on. So I've got down here, 1968 was one of the most tumultuous years in recent history, including two major assassinations. And in similarity with a lot of these years we've been covering, progress and destruction at the same time. Obviously the destruction is war and civil rights, events that happened, at demonstrations and so forth. But then you have got progress. The world did progress in the 60s, whatever anyone says.
Mm-hmm.
So a quick question to you before we get into the events. Last time we did 69, we were saying about these years were so incredibly eventful. But if you think about the last 20 years as we've been living them now, we've had 9/11, we've had the Afghanistan and the Iraq wars, we've had numerous virus outbreaks, of course, COVID having dominated, and then we've had the whole technology, social media, smartphone revolution. So just a quick question to you. Do you think these years that we're looking at were more eventful than now, or is it just different events?
Well, I think that the smartphone is one of the biggest deals in technology, in the history of technology. I think that all these wars you mentioned, even going back to Vietnam, they're so far away. There's a great detachment for people in the West, I think, with them. And if you want to detach, you can do that. If you want to involve yourself, you can do that too. And that started in the 60s. And there was a pop cultural revolution through music, which enabled that message to be heard more. Now, obviously now, a lot of these messages in the social media, it's co-opted, it's controlled, it's censored. It's all filtered in through some kind of a veil. But it seems that there's always stuff going on. Mm-hmm. There's never going to be peace in it all. There's always going to be something brewing. And, it seems like when there isn't, let's make something happen. Let's make something brew,
Yeah.
That's what it seems like.
But you're absolutely right about the fact that, nowadays, the number of people who get a daily newspaper, for example, has gone way down. So people obviously spend their time generally getting news from websites. And you're right. You've got the choice. You can either get very, very involved, or you can completely ignore it. You can distract yourself with whatever. And I think we all, I'm guilty of distracting myself,
mm-hmm.
but I do try to have some sort of engagement at the same time. So let's get on to some of these cheery events.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that very sarcastically. So I'm going to just sort of guide us through the year, and then please comment on anything you'd like to comment on. So in January, there's one thing I wanted to mention. Alexander Dubchek became the leader of Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia was obviously was under communist, under Soviet rule, I should say. Dubček was apparently more progressive. He supported liberal reforms and tried to establish, quote, communism with a human face. In August, the tanks rolled into Prague. Some of those photos are very famous. And Dubček was replaced by a pro-Soviet leader. Now, I just wanted to tell you and the listeners something that was quite interesting. The sort of mainstream view, or let's say the Western, almost you could say capitalist view of the world, is that communism is terrible and capitalism is good. And the idea is that when a liberal reformer comes in, the communists will immediately try to get rid of them. But I just wanted to make the point really that, because I've studied this a lot, this is really what capitalists do as well. And if you're familiar with Animal Farm, I'm sure you are, the George Orwell
mm-hmm.
book. The pigs are based on the communists. It's based on Stalin. The head pig is Stalin. And the humans represent the capitalists. Now, very interesting, at the very end of Animal Farm, some of the pigs walk in, and the head pigs and the humans are having dinner together, and the pigs are walking on 2 feet. Essentially, the pigs have become exactly the same as humans. And I think Orwell was trying to make the point that perhaps high-level communists and high-level capitalists aren't as different as we're led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to labour this, but the 1954 Animal Farm animated film, which is pretty good, has one crucial difference. In the end, you don't see the humans, you just see the pigs, making the point that it's just the communists that go rogue. And interestingly, that animated film was funded by the CIA, would you believe?
Oh,
that sounds like
really?
something that someone's made up, but it is actually absolutely fact.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was really interesting, the way that little things get changed. Vietnam's a huge part of this year, and I mean, really, a lot of Vietnam is about high-level capitalism. I won't go into it now, but it's worth checking out. And then the other really big event, first of all, there's the Battle of Ksan, which is a region in South Vietnam. And then, of course, the last couple of days of January, we get the Tet Offensive. And for those who don't know, Tet is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam, and the Viet Cong took advantage of this to launch a major offensive that actually backfired in the end. But anyway, this was a year where the TV war aspect of Vietnam really came through. You know, you were saying earlier about wars seem very far away. Now, Vietnam seemed far away, but the difference is that all the blood and guts was being shown on the TV.
Yeah, I think that the television in the 60s really took hold, and it was the first time we saw war on TV and on the news, because in the 50s, during the Korean War. I mean, people were still accumulating televisions. I mean, it happened very quickly in the United States, but color TVs weren't that common in the first half of the 60s. It was an expensive item. By 67, 68, you not only saw the war on television, but you're starting to see it in color, So we see this with Rodney King in the late 80s, where if nobody was running a video camera, nobody would have gave a shit. Just some guy that got beat up by the cops. And then that was also censored. We didn't see the lead up to Rodney King's behavior before the police beat the tar out of him, which is important to have. So, I mean, the importance of that video, I mean, the whole city rioted. I knew somebody who was living there at the time. So it's probably the most important sense with regard to reaction. And that started happening in the 60s. And you combine the music and the hippie movement and the anti-war movement, which are two different things, etc. Those are all combining together to really change history.
Absolutely, yes. And the present day has quite a few similarities with the 60s, not least the fact that, the alternative media that I've been a little part of, and our mutual friend James Corbett is very involved in that. A lot of that is really what was happening in the 60s, and we've kind of gone back to that and realised that some of those ideals were actually very good. But just to maybe make the general point that you kind of made already, that things get co-opted, and it's not to denigrate for a second, the suffering of people that is caught on camera, but the media is controlled. I just want to make that general point really to the listeners, although they probably know if they've been listening long enough to Glass Onion, that things are not always what they seem, basically. I think we'd agree on that. That's interesting what you said, because before the 60s, we didn't see a lot of the graphic images because people didn't have a telly. And then after the 60s, I would say, the lesson learned from Vietnam, it's going to sound horribly cynical, was actually not to show any blood and guts on the telly, because they didn't really learn a lesson. Because if you look at when America pulled out of Afghanistan, the footage is almost identical to Saigon, where you've got people hanging off the US military planes. We were talking about this last year. So I don't think that lesson was really learned, to be perfectly honest. They learned a different lesson, I think. Am I horribly cynical, or what do you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's really sad to say that sometimes I don't know how much the general population should weigh in on war, because how many people know what's really going on and what led up to it? Almost nobody. So maybe there is some advantage in keeping some of that more covert, and it's, top secret or most secret or whatever those terms are. They allow you to win the war, provided you're in there for noble reasons, which is anybody's guess. But, in the 60s, it was the first time I think the public really had a say, and really there was a backlash, obviously. And you had all kinds of buildings being blown up here on campuses and shootings and things. And that was a result of that. I mean, that didn't, so far as I know, that wasn't happening in any other American wars, because there was just no media to support that.
Yeah, I think that's why I find the 60s so fascinating, both for good and bad reasons, because I always say, if I was born in 75, if I'd been alive in the 60s, or a sort of teenager, or in my 20s, I would have formed a band and gone to London. Whether I would have been successful or not, who knows? But I feel like I would have been a protester as well, because it was more innocent in a funny way. Innocent in the sense that the media, like I say, hadn't learned to filter everything. They're filtering, obviously there's some filtering that always goes on. But, the famous shots of Walter Cronkite when he, went out there and his broadcasts, that seems way more than you get now. I mean, it just seems horribly filtered. None of it seems real anymore. TV news is a joke, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's pathetic here. I mean, that's why I have to go to alternate sources to get news, and I think you need multiple sources to take it all in, and you get maybe closer to the truth, but, it's just, it's an edit of sorts that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, we can spend a lifetime, if you're looking for the truth, trying to find it, and whether you find it or not, you never know. But I feel like when you find a little kernel of truth that seems real, I kind of grasp onto that myself, I consider that a victory.
Agreed.
Okay, we're just going to go through, go to March. Robert F. Kennedy enters the presidential race, which is very important. And the same month, LBJ Lyndon Johnson utters the famous words, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party as your president." So Johnson's out the race. I think it was actually the same day, I think I've got that right, the My Lai massacre happens. And all I really want to say about the My Lai massacre, it was uncovered the year later by Seymour Hersh, Cy Hersh. Again, having studied this quite a bit, the big lie really is that My Lai was some isolated case. And in fact, I did talk to Douglas Valentine, Life and Life Only podcast, episode 14, about the Phoenix program, so that's worth checking out for the listeners, and also a book called Kill Anything That Moves by Nick Turse. And just to say that it's been pretty much well proven that there were hundreds of My Lais. It wasn't an isolated case.
And do we know how many women and children were killed or how many civilians were killed in that massacre? Do we have a number on that?
I mean, we could look it up if you want.
Because, as you said, it's believed that many of those type of massacres happened. I mean, you had all kinds of covert things that, Americans couldn't tell North Vietnamese from South Vietnamese, and you can see where these things could have happened very easily. And to just suggest it was just one isolated incident is probably not realistic.
Not at all, no. I've just checked. Between 347 and 504 unarmed people were killed. Of course, we know one guy was prosecuted, William Calley Jr., found guilty of murdering 22 villagers. He was given a life sentence, then served 3.5 years under house arrest after Nixon commuted his sentence. So, there's a history of non-culpability. Sometimes one person is found guilty to set some sort of example, but yeah, really, I just wanted to give that message to the listeners, really. Vietnam's not a nice thing to research, of course, but the truth of it is so different. And then early April, while in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers, Martin Luther King gives a sermon in which he tells listeners, quote, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you." That's a telling line, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And then the following evening he's killed standing on the balcony outside his room at a motel in Memphis. All I'm going to say about this is for my other podcast, Life and Life Only, but if anyone wants to research this further, the work of William Pepper, who I believe is a lawyer, he did a book called An Act of State, and he filed a civil suit on behalf of the King family, and a 12-person jury, 6 black, 6 white, found that there was a conspiracy. So anyway, just want to put that one out there. What are your thoughts on not on who killed Martin Luther King, but the murder itself?
Well, 68, as you mentioned earlier, we look at 67 as the summer of love, 68 as the year of revolt, and we have got 2 major assassinations, King and coming up with Robert F. Kennedy. And I think the pump was primed in 63 with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And he was rather beloved in the States. He wasn't completely all successful, but there was an ideal in the early 60s. I remember my dad telling me this because he voted for Kennedy. And my dad, he said this years ago to me. He said, John F. Kennedy made you want to stand up and do something for your country. Now, that's pretty powerful. So that dream was dashed. And then with Vietnam coming in, it just seemed like everything was going to hell. But with King, with the progress being made with civil rights, and to have him killed in that fashion, that's when everything hit the fan. My parents were in Chicago at that time, and there was riots in Chicago, riots in all the major urban centers in the country, really, here in the States. My mom was pregnant with me at the time, and my dad could see the smoke in west of the city from his apartment building, and it just started going crazy. And everybody started jumping on and having an opinion about it. And 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. So it's like there's very big things going on here. In hindsight, now with all this time and the way we kind of understand how the world works, these don't seem like random accidents of crazy people just going off. This seems to be something worked. And obviously then we had Malcolm X, who was also assassinated in 65. The civil rights took a lot of hits, and I think they had to for it to continue to move forward. It's too bad. We haven't had anybody like King since, which is quite interesting. So it was a much bigger loss, I think. Had I been there at the time, I would have said, well, somebody else will rise up and take his place, but nobody did. Yeah. So mission accomplished.
I suppose at the same time, just to put a more optimistic spin on it, if there is one, he said, this quote, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Now, well, it's arguable that they haven't got to the promised land, but some progress has been made. We need to kind of remember that. And this is actually the year of the Civil Rights Act. In fact, I believe it was actually signed a week later.
After he was killed?
Yeah, now that's quite curious because there's no way you can put together a bill. Presumably it's a huge bill in 7 days, so presumably it was on the table already. Just a little side note. So I was saying that this William Pepper filed a civil suit on behalf of the family. Were you aware that in 1995, when O.J. Simpson was found innocent in a criminal trial, were you aware that he was found guilty in a civil trial?
Yes.
And he actually owes, I mean, the last time I checked, which was about 15 years ago, not recently, he actually owed the family of Nicole Brown millions of dollars. I mean, many millions of dollars. I don't know anything about the law, really. I'm not going to comment, but it's a strange quirk of the law that can happen. Obviously, yeah, the King assassination had huge ramifications. But the way the news cycle goes, I don't know exactly what it was like at this time because I wasn't there, I wasn't alive. The news cycle nowadays moves so fast that, you know, the mainstream focus or the focus of the masses, again, to generalize, it shifts so quickly. I don't know whether when Robert Kennedy was killed, maybe, I don't know if people's attention shifted to that. I mean, presumably there were reverberations of the King assassination for a long time. You'd want to think there were. You don't want it just to dissolve into history quickly, do you?
I think it moved quickly. I mean, my study of all these musical acts in the 60s, I mean, the King assassination, there was concerts, especially in the South, that were halted, that they were canceled. Things came to a standstill for a few days. But like everything else, I think everything just resumed. You just carry on. You know, you just plow ahead. And as we said earlier, this is the point where 1968 gets darker and the 60s closes out in a very dark way.
Yeah.
And this is just some of the beginnings of that.
Yeah, I suppose it's good in one way that we move on from things, but then it's sad that things get forgotten. I mean, obviously he's not forgotten. They have a Martin Luther King Day in the States, but anyway, that was a very big event. And so we've got the Civil Rights Act, and then and this is a bit of British news in April as well. Enoch Powell did his famous Rivers of Blood speech. Now, Matt, being a big Beatles fan, do you know what Beatles song references Enoch Powell? Unreleased Beatles song.
Oh, is that the Get Back, the No More Pakistanis?
Yeah, Commonwealth.
Commonwealth, yeah. Commonwealth.
Commonwealth, yes, that one. So he mentions Enoch Powell. Well, that was a few months later, actually, the beginning of '69, so it wasn't straight after, but that was a big noise in England. And then also in April, Hair opened on Broadway. Now, I've never been to a stage show of Hair, or I think there was a film made, I haven't seen that, but for anyone who doesn't know, it's a story of hippies and they're fighting against conscription into the Vietnam War. Have you seen any performances of Hair, or do you know much about that?
Well, I saw the film, which must have come out in '69, and it's not my thing. I don't like those kind of musicals. I didn't care for it, but it's very much a period piece.
Was it making any valid points? Do you know, was it making them well or not?
Well, by the time I saw it, which was in the mid-'90s, all those points had been made. I didn't really look at it from that perspective. It just seemed so dated that nobody could, even in the day, you wonder if the points were even felt.
Yeah.
I mean, there's better ways to make the point, I would assume, and this was just kind of a theatrical way to do it. That's the way I see it.
All right, any listeners who know Hair well, please send me a message and tell me if it was good or what points it made and if it made them well.
The hit song Hair was done by the Cowsills, so they weren't the most cutting edge of bands at the time.
Right.
Mother and children group, so.
Oh, I don't know anything about them. I'm going to plead ignorance on that one. There's so much student activism this year. I mean, we can't go through all of it, but obviously Paris, that was in May. On the streets of Paris, I mean, there was a lot of demonstrations and they turned violent, as you said. You know, there was a lot of that and things were getting darker and darker, as you said. On May the 6th, known as Bloody Monday, students and police clashed in Paris's Latin Quarter, resulting in hundreds of injuries. There was millions of French workers striking, and Charles de Gaulle actually dissolved the National Assembly, called for immediate elections and threatened military intervention. We've seen that so often since then, you know, people who study history closely. Again, it's hard to know how much of a deal it was back then. I'm going to presume it was a big deal. Seriously, I would like to hear from any listeners who are slightly older and were actually around at that time and knew about that. I'd like to know what they believe the significance of these events was.
The other thing I'm always curious about, in America at least, the unrest in the universities was anti-war. It wasn't really hippie, which I always like to separate those two things because the hippie movement was more easily co-opted. Both were, but the demonstrations were more of an anti-war feeling. I don't know if that's the same in, for instance, like France or in Europe, if the demonstrations there were different or they kind of combined other issues. I mean, when aren't the French striking? You know, you always hear that. So I do know in America it got very, you had the Weathermen, you had all these groups, you had all these, the Black Panthers started to get powerful. There were bombs being blown up on universities, and it was getting very, very militant.
Yes.
here in the States. I'm not sure how militant it was in Europe, but things happened very quickly here.
I think there was some crossover. I mean, okay, if you take a famous image of putting flowers in guns, you could say that that's hippie ideals confronting war. I mean, that may have been a kind of a photo op. Again, I don't know a lot about that.
And I think that was 67 as well. So I think that's that whole flower power era where things are a little more sunshiny.
There is a fantastic book I'd like to recommend actually to you and the listeners called Acid Dreams. I did the audiobook actually earlier this year. And it's very, very good about what happened. As we said earlier, Haight-Ashbury arguably peaked actually around 65, 66. Everything got commercialized, as we said earlier, as it happens. But there was a melding. Suddenly you had hippie groups who sort of melded into anti-war groups, who then melded from peaceful anti-war groups into militant groups, as you were saying. So you know, they got Weathermen, the Black Panthers, and you got someone like John Lennon. We've already covered this in the 72 episode we did. He's kind of with the hippies, and he's count me out, count me in, as we'll hear later. But it gets co-opted, it all gets melded, and it all gets very fuzzy, you know. We're never quite sure who's who. I mean, it's incredibly fascinating. I will continue to study this period forever, probably, to try and get some kernels of truth. A little bit more British news. The Cray Twins, they were gangsters in London. They were arrested. And, Matt, I don't know how much you know about soccer, but have you ever heard of George Best?
No, I have not.
Okay, we would presume in Britain that everyone's heard of George Best, but of course there will be American footballers and baseball players that everyone in America will have heard of, and we were going, oh, who the hell's that, you know. Anyway, George Best was he was from Northern Ireland, and he was one of the best footballers ever. I think that's fairly universally accepted. I only mention that because Man United became the first English team to win the European Cup. George Best had been nicknamed El Beatle because he came back from a tour of Spain, and he had wonderful flowing locks, rather like your own. The listeners can't see that, but they can if they watch your channel. The press nicknamed him El Beatle, so he was well in with the Beatles, kind of, you know, the long hair, fashionable long hair, and he was a bit of a heartthrob as well. Moving back to darker matters, as you mentioned earlier, Robert F. Kennedy was also assassinated June the 5th. I mean, this one, arguably, again, if you study it, is even more suspect than Martin Luther King, but that's, you know, that's for another discussion, really. It was the night of the California primary, and he won it, which put him in reach of securing the Democratic presidential nomination. He was killed by Sirhan, again, Google, MK Ultra, CIA mind control. Was he a good bet to win the presidency? Do you know anything about how popular he was at that time?
Well, the name Kennedy carried quite a lot of weight, and there was optimism, and there was still a hangover from the JFK assassination. There was a lot of love for JFK, and getting Bobby in there there was hope. The left-wing liberal side of the equation was pro-Kennedy. He was more of an anti-war guy. At that time in the United States, the House, the Senate, and the President were all Democrats. Right. So you have another Democrat coming in who was more, I guess he was more civil rights guy, but he was, I think, more anti-war. The Kennedy family, their clashes with some of the like mob types of the world, I don't understand that very well, but there's some very big things going on underneath it all. But it was interesting. He joined the race late, and that was designed, and 2 months later he was dead. I mean, people didn't think this was a coincidence, and they were angry, you know, and he was very popular. You hear this hope and change from the Obama thing. I mean, that was all very sugary, but this really was, the way I see it in retrospect, really was it was hope of some kind. Yeah. And he was talking about, I think, even eliminating minimum wage, and he was more progressive in terms of just equality, I think. Yeah. It was all dashed.
Noam Chomsky loves pointing out that Obama's campaign actually won an award in the marketing industry.
Well, that tells it all, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of empty calories, if you want to call it that.
I think we went from 2 wars to 7 wars under Obama, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, well, he won. I mean, this wasn't really his fault, but he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And in not so many words, the guy from Nobel said, we're giving this award to encourage him to do peaceful acts. So I was going to write to Nobel and say, well, can you give me an award? And I'll promise to do lots of peaceful acts in the future.
And that was just after he was named president. I don't know how long after.
Very soon after, yeah.
And somebody said, I forget, maybe it was Christopher Hitchens, said that's like awarding the Oscar before the film is made. So there you have it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, just to say that I think the days when things can just get written off as conspiracy theories and there's no other discussion, I hope we've at least moved on from that. And like you said, two guys who were pro-civil rights and against the Vietnam War died within a couple of months of each other. Final thing on the Vietnam War, because like I say, it does tend to dominate these years. The more I study it, the more it becomes, I think it's about high-level capitalism. And when you try and get in the way of that, of serious amounts of money that could be made from wars, I think that's when you're putting yourself in great danger.
And you're speaking of the war machine in particular, correct?
Yeah, I mean the military-industrial complex, which was warned about by Eisenhower, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. That's a very famous clip. It was his closing address just before Kennedy came in. Okay, one thing that I know you did want to talk about was we move into August. Anything special about August 1968 in your life? Would you like to reveal that?
Well, I was born on the 26th of August, and that was during the Democratic National Convention that was held in Chicago. And I don't have any memory of the day, but was born a few miles north of Chicago and grew up here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a wonderful time to be born because really by the time I have any memories, it's in the 70s, and a lot of the strife of the 60s was in the past. So I was born in the year of revolt, I guess, conceived in the summer of love, and, you could be flowy about all this stuff.
Yeah.
I was born on the day the Beatles released the biggest hit, all that kind of stuff. But really, it's not about that.
When I invited you to do this show, I didn't know you were born in that year. And there's a weird parallel, because the last time I did one of these shows was 69. And the guy who was on that, Scott, my friend, was born in 69.
Ah.
But I feel like now I'm not going to start looking for people who were born in that particular year. We'll just leave it as a nice coincidence.
Okay.
But you were telling me the other day that your dad had some specific memories of that. So this was the DNC, wasn't it? Democratic National Convention, and it was a huge demonstration, apparently including the Yippies and the Black Panthers.
The thing I remember the most reading about had to do with it was going to be a full-on demonstration, 60s style, with bands and all the accoutrements that come with that kind of protesting back in the day. Mm. And the only band that had the balls to show up to this were the MC5 from Detroit. The Jefferson Airplane was supposed to be there, and these California bands, they couldn't have hacked it, so the MC5 shows up, and there was strife in the town, and actually my folks were not in Chicago at the time. They were up in Milwaukee, so I was being born, and so they had their hands full there. And I'll have to talk to them about this, but what were they thinking during all this time? They're bringing a baby into the world, and you just had RFK and King shot, and you've got demonstrations going on and anti-war stuff, and the riots from the King assassination, all in one, roughly about a 4 or 5 month span. Must have felt like the world was ending.
Well, I suppose they would say when you were conceived, it looked like things were a bit better. So.
Yeah, it was a Monterey Pop Festival or whatever. Oh, this is great.
You know that Giles Martin, George Martin's son, was conceived during the Get Back sessions.
Oh, was he?
So he makes this joke about, have a look for George Martin on a particular day when he's got a big smile on his face.
Well, George Martin wasn't there a lot, so what else was he going to do? He might as well be home and with the wife,
That's true,
That's kind of a nice way.
There you go. There is a Beatles connection, of course, with the MC5. Their manager for a while was John Sinclair. I don't even need to tell John Lennon fans about John Sinclair. Okay, we're going to jump to October. Just a couple of interesting events here. Again, this is a British one. Police baton civil rights demonstrators in Derry, which is in Northern Ireland, marking the start of the Troubles. And, of course, Bloody Sunday was in 72, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney both wrote a song about that. Give Ireland Back to the Irish was Paul's song, and then obviously Sunday Bloody Sunday. 16th of October, after being awarded gold and bronze medals in the 200-metre sprint in the Summer Olympics in Mexico City, US athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos bowed their heads and raised their black-gloved fists in a recognised salute to the Black Power movement during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. I'm sure you've heard about that, right?
For sure, yeah. People still use that symbol.
Yeah, that's right. Another topical event as we are talking here, 22nd of October, the Gun Control Act of 1968 enacted. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
November, Nixon gets elected. This is the famous, the silent majority, which again, some people think he probably imagined He said it was the silent majority that had voted for him. Of course, the next election, again, we already covered this in a previous show, but that was the big one, really, where his majority basically put the end to John Lennon's political activities. As we'll see later, John Lennon was very undecided at this point. There's a certain song which, of course, came out on the day you were born. And just a couple more at the end of the year. December the 3rd is a musical one, Elvis's Comeback Special, which, of course, wasn't called the Comeback Special, aired on NBC. Fantastic little detail, sponsored by the Sewing Machine Company, Singer. We did a show about John Lennon and Elvis. What would you like to say about that? I'm presuming you've seen that.
I've actually not seen it, just clips.
Oh, really?
I think the Elvis thing in 1968 here is somewhat important because having grown up in the 70s, there was a throwback to the 50s. So you had the sock hop, this kind of greaser thing. You had the movie Grease. You had the TV show Happy Days. At Woodstock, the band Sha Na Na appeared, which was a kind of a very odd inclusion for that festival, but it's a 50s style band. And here you see a 50s singer, the biggest singer of all time, in what we're calling the comeback. This, to me, was the kind of kickoff to, okay, let's forget the 60s and remember some better times. That would be the 50s, when things were, the custard stand or the malt shop when you're convertible and have a girl on roller skates delivered to you. That was what was being shown and remembered in the 70s. I think this was the beginning. I think it was a response to all the upheaval in the 60s, actually.
It's very interesting how nostalgia can happen very quickly. Because also in the late 60s we had the country revival, arguably started by the Basement Tapes. I don't know, others may disagree, and John Wesley Harding album. Because you had that going on as well. Then the Byrds, I'm sure you just covered this, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which came out this year.
Yeah, the thing called country rock is interesting. There's always an argument who started it first, but that's not important. It's just that everybody started it at the same time. Even some British musicians were leaning country. The Beatles a bit, the Stones, there are others. And then there was a British folk revival in the late 60s too with the Incredible String Band and Pentangle. So it was getting back to roots of sorts. And in America, what we call Americana, that was best described through country. Yeah. And it's picked up through the 70s a bit, and the whole California sound was kind of based on that. The Eagles and Poco and all those bands.
We'll actually be getting to that in a sec because we're going to go through the singles and albums in a minute, and there's definitely a bit of that going on. And then on the 24th of December, so Christmas Eve, ended on a positive note as 3 astronauts aboard Apollo 8. Jim Lovell, was that the one who was played by Tom Hanks? Apollo 13, maybe?
I don't remember who Hanks played.
I've got to stop mentioning things that I don't know for sure. Just means I have to do tons of editing. But then I get to look at it, and then I do it as if I knew all along. So that's the power of editing.
You wouldn't believe the amount of editing I do.
Oh, I do loads.
In my videos.
It does sound lovely when you listen back. Jim Lovell, who of course was played by Tom Hanks in Apollo 13. But this is Apollo 8. They became the first humans to orbit the moon. I've got some reservations about all that money spent on the space program. What was it actually for in the end, other than to get one over on the Soviets? Anyway, but, it's progress of a sort, I suppose. Okay, what we often do with these is births and deaths, but to be honest, I've just got a handful. I don't know if you've got any there, but February, Lisa Marie Presley, there's a musical one. August, Matt Williamson. Oh, sorry, we've done that already. Yes, and in October, just a couple more musical ones. Tom York of Radiohead, and Ziggy Marley, eldest son of Bob, of course. And then I think I've literally got 2 deaths. Now this is one. This is a very tenuous link. Wendell Corey, who was in in the film Rear Window, and Matt was on my podcast Film Gold episode 16. We reviewed Rear Window, so there you go. And then the other one was John Steinbeck, who's not really a Beatles connection, but he's a great author. Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, etc. All right, films. If I had been around at this time, I mean, for me, this is just a dream. I know a lot of people prefer 70s, 80s, whatever, but for films and music, I just find it mind-boggling how good these years were. But a quick point to make about films. 2 of the biggest films of the year were Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand and Oliver. They dominated the awards. It's interesting, we found this last time with 69. You get very traditional singles that kind of hark back and traditional films, but then you've got sort of more progressive, quote-unquote, happening at the same time. So are there any films you just like to mention from that year? And then I'll just bosh through a list quickly.
Well, from 68, I guess the two musical films that come to mind are the Beatles animated feature, Yellow Submarine, and then The Monkey's Head. And both of those movies are very much period pieces. 68 was a pivotal year in filmmaking, in America anyway, because that's the year they adopted the rating system, which allowed for more adult content, nudity, profanity, adult themes, violence. So all of that, which I still view as like a reality. So you have all of that going on, and as you mentioned, you've got these kind of fantasy type of films that are being done that are very strange in many cases. And it's just a year of extremes in filmmaking.
Yep. The big one for me, this is a very, very polarizing film, but this is right at the top of my list, 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm just an enormous Kubrick fan, and you and I at some point we are going to do The Killing, one of his early ones on Film Gold. I think we locked that one in. We haven't locked the date in, but we said we'd do that. I'll just chuck out a few more. Night of the Living Dead, we also just reviewed Film Gold episode 17. Night of the Living Dead is one of the original zombie films, but it really set the standard in my opinion. And there was a civil rights aspect in that the main character was black, and it was never mentioned once in the film that he was black. And Rob Ager, who was on that show with me, we thought that was a fantastic way of making a statement by not mentioning it, you know? Very, very interesting. So Night of the Living Dead is a huge favourite of mine. I'll just check out a few more names. Once Upon a Time in the West, a kind of updated Western. You've seen, what's the one with William Holden? Oh, God, I'm blanking.
The Wild Bunch.
The Wild Bunch, yeah. They're kind of a piece in the sense they're a bit more violent and a bit more visceral, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think of Yellow Submarine, and what do you think of Head? I like Yellow Submarine. Obviously, the Beatles weren't really involved with that much, but what do you think of that and Head?
Well, there was a whole trend in filmmaking at this time, and it was counterculture filmmaking that two films that jump out at me. The Trip, which was Peter Fonda, that's kind of about an acid trip. It's very difficult to watch. The other one called Psych Out, which may have been Roger Corman. You had these exploitation films about the hippies and things, and most of them are just terrible films. And Yellow Submarine is so different. I always found it slightly disturbing. I've never liked it much. You know, I don't even care for that style of animation. I don't even know who did the animation, but it feels so much more European, kind of what Python did afterwards with the still drawings and things.
I mean, the director was Canadian, George Dunning.
Okay.
I don't know a lot about that film, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I've never felt a strong Beatle connection to that film anyway. They don't do the voices, which I thought was extremely stupid to not do. That's probably the reason I like it the least. And the songs, I would prefer all new songs, but, you know, it's older songs that don't fit in as well. Moving over to the Monkey's Head film, this is very interesting because the Monkees, the biggest band of 1967, they outsold the Beatles in America in 1967, if you can believe it. And they were so full of themselves that by 1968, you know, they were too big to do the show, and they did this film written with Jack Nicholson that basically destroyed the Monkees myth. And nobody was interested because all the kids who liked the Monkees could not understand this super psychedelic film, and all the cool counterculture people were not going to go see a movie by the Monkees anyway. It was one of the biggest stiffs of the year. But the idea of killing the Monkees myth was not unlike the Beatles killing their myth, or Lennon killing it just a year or two later. And it's just this, the street cred was on the counterculture side, not on the squeaky clean side. And there was this shift. And 1968 was really that fulcrum, I think, where that shift really took hold.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the Beatles did film an insert, didn't they, this year for that? But yeah, the voices, they kind of started this whole sort of, hello, Ringo, how you doing, all right? That sort of fake Liverpool accent.
Yeah, it was I guess, is that supposed to be an exaggerated Liverpool accent, or were they trying to sound like a Liverpool accent? I never know.
No, it's for comedic effect. It's kind of like the impressions that myself and Sam Wiles and other people do.
Okay.
Sorry, Sam, if you're listening. I like your impressions of Paul, but we all sort of try oh, yeah, it's great, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, again, if any listeners have seen Head and they like it, because it is a cult film, it feels like it's one of those films that certain people may have seen it, 100 times and have found some meaning that I haven't seen because I've literally only seen it once, so I'm not going to judge.
Well, if you compare it to the other movies I mentioned, like The Trip or Psych Out, it's far better.
Right.
And I don't know that they had a ton more money behind it, but probably, or if you care to compare it to Magical Mystery Tour, far better. I mean, Magical Mystery Tour, I mean, they're trying to prop it up nowadays, but it just isn't a good film in any way, really, other than the music videos, which is kind of cool. But yeah, this whole psychedelic thing added to films was in vogue, and like you said, when it becomes into the mainstream, it's already jumped the shark.
I have a subjective love for Magical Mystery Tour. I just like it because I love the Beatles in '67, the way they look and everything. I'm not going to come and say it's like an amazing achievement, but although Paul likes saying the story that Scorsese likes it, or Spielberg or someone. I think there's some really interesting ideas, like, we're not talking about that now, but the spaghetti, the bit with John Lennon as the waiter and the spaghetti. There's some good camera work in that bit.
Had they brought in an actual screenwriter and had a director, I think that could have been made into something interesting. The spaghetti scene was actually a dream John Lennon had, and to try to put that to film, that's high-level artistry. Yeah. And it could have been made into something, but obviously the Beatles they were in over their heads. And Epstein had only died just 2 months earlier, roughly. It had legs to it, but they just executed it poorly.
There was a dream John Lennon had, and he was dressed like Bobby Dykins, who was his mother's common-law husband. Dykins worked as a waiter, a sleazy waiter, as John Lennon called him, years later. And he used to dip his hand in the butter and use it as Brill cream in his hair.
And did he have a little mustache, too?
I think he did, yeah.
I never put that together that he was aping twitchy Dykins.
That's it. I'll just bosh through the titles of some other films from that year, which I think have some note. So there's a film called If, British film, with Malcolm McDowell. It's a proto-Clockwork Orange in terms of Malcolm McDowell. It's a completely different setting, but he's playing... It's a proto-Alex DeLarge from Clockwork Orange. Romeo and Juliet, it's a Zeffirelli version. It's one of the best Shakespeare films for sure. Rosemary's Baby, there's a Beatles connection. When I was on your show last time, I was talking about the fact that in that film you actually see a dead body just outside the Dakota, covered in blood, very near to where John Lennon would be killed 12 years later, and there's a white Beetle parked by the road. Make of that what you will. There may be nothing to it, but it's a very weird, just a curiosity, if nothing else. There you go. A weird film called The Swimmer with Burt Lancaster that I've seen once. It's all about rich people who have swimming pools, and he's a swimmer, and he crashes their parties and swims in their pools. It's absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, you can see how these movies were taking a psychedelic turn and getting extremely surreal and using older actors like Lancaster. Another movie, I think it was 1967, it's the Casino Royale, the kind of parody of James Bond, which has Orson Welles in it and Peter Sellers and Deborah Kerr, maybe David Niven. And it's just a completely incomprehensible film, overindulgent, and they just took it too far. And some of it works well. I have not seen The Swimmer. I'll have to put that on my list, but it just permeated everything, it seemed.
Yeah, from what I remember, there wasn't too much actual surreal sort of camera work in that film, but obviously the concept is pretty weird. And you're right, because Once Upon a Time in the West, which is sort of modern-ish Western in the sense that it was bringing the genre forward, showing more visceral violence, as we said earlier, that had Henry Fonda as the bad guy. And a brilliant bad guy as well, because Henry Fonda that was totally going against type. Just a few more, a bit of a Beatles connection. There's a film called Candy, which is sort of so bad it's good, with Ringo. Marlon Brando was in that as well, though they weren't in the same scene. If you want a completely skewed version of Vietnam, there's the Green Berets with John Wayne. There's Bullet with Steve McQueen with a famous car chase. You've got The Producers, Springtime for Hitler and all that. Thomas Crown Affair with Steve McQueen. Obviously many, many others, but those are the ones that sort of leapt out.
Yeah, I think McQueen, that's the year that he really became a superstar. And there's this anti-hero that carried the 60s into the 70s on screen anyway. We didn't really have that, once Bogart went away. You didn't have that kind of character. McQueen he became that.
Yeah, and I mean, we just reviewed Taxi Driver for Film Gold. Obviously, Travis Bickle was a kind of an anti-hero, and maybe the other really good example would be McMurphy, Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But yeah, very interesting. Okay, just quickly do singles. Are there any that kind of leap out from that year?
Well, 1968 is the year. Let me back up to 67 again because there's precedent set. So the release of Sgt. Pepper, which in the last 10, 15 years has been downplayed, the importance of that album. But one of the main things and the main contributions of that album was that rock music and pop music just splintered after that. And by 1968, you had this very heavy rock come out. I mean, that Cream really took over with Wheels of Fire, but you had bands in the States like Blue Cheer that was extremely loud. That you also had bubblegum music like Chewy Chewy and Yummy 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 and Green Tambourine. So you had these two things entering the charts at the same time. But the heavy stuff was more for FM. So you had a very multiple genres at the same time in the charts. And I think that was a population issue as well. But music just continued to progress and take off and sell more.
We found that with 69, like I said, we went through the singles. I think we went through all the number ones from Britain, anyway. Mm-hmm. And you've got these two things coexisting. So you've got a sort of Hey Jude, which is progressive in not only the fact it's 7.5 minutes. That was a big deal. And then Jumpin' Jack Flash was a huge deal for the Stones. You know, they'd had a rough 67, as we said earlier, getting arrested and everything. You had Jimi Hendrix Is All Along the Watchtower, which I would know more as an album track. I don't think Jimi Hendrix... I guess originally he was a singles guy with Hey Jude and... Hey Jude. Originally he was a singles guy with Hey Joe and Purple Haze. But you've got sort of more, I don't know, progressive, not meaning prog rock, but sort of moving things forward. And then you've got Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, and you've got Build Me Up Buttercup, and you've got Can't Take My Eyes Off You, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, if you look at the number one songs of 68, I mean, they're extremely saccharine in the first half of the year. You've got the number one song, So Hello, Goodbye, which was number one in late 67, was still hanging on early 68. Judy in Disguise with Glasses, that's a bubblegum song. Green Tambourine, bubblegum. Yeah. Love is Blue by Paul Marriott. And then we have Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which is a reflective song that was recorded in, I think, in July of 67, maybe. I can't remember when it was recorded, but held back and released in the wake of Otis Redding's death. Honey by Bobby Goldsboro. It's a pretty sugary song. Tighten Up, Archie Bell and the Drell, Mrs. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel. That The Graduate film was huge, and that spilled into 1968. The only real rock song we have on the chart at number one is Hello, I Love You by The Doors. You've got Hey Jude, which was the biggest hit of the year. I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye. So you really have, as far as AM radio goes, it's extremely AM on the charts. And People Gotta Be Free was by the Rascals. That was 5 weeks at number one here in the States. And that was kind of addressed in a very AM radio friendly. That was kind of the showing for the civil rights on the charts at that time.
Oh, very interesting, yeah. I mean, you've even got What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. I'll give you my Louis Armstrong impression privately, not on the air. Just one thing, actually, on Judy in Disguise with Glasses, yeah, John Fred and his Playboy band, I've got that here. Apparently that came that when they heard Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, they thought it was Lucy in Disguise with Diamonds.
Yes.
But then they had the idea of taking that, you know, and it's Judy in Disguise with Glasses. Psychedelia, Flower Power, whatever, was already being parodied. And there's a Frank Zappa album, which we'll come to in a second as well. But if I could just boss through this list, I mean, this is just fantastic. Days by the Kinks, Going Up the Country. I'm the Urban Spaceman, with a Bonzo Dog Doodah band produced by Mr. McCartney. Jennifer Juniper by Donovan. Lady Madonna, obviously the Beatles. Lazy Sunday. Light My Fire, the Jose Feliciano version. Mighty Quinn, which had Klaus Voormann on bass. Obla Obla by Marmalade, written by Paul. Piece of My Heart by Big Brother and the Holding Company, that's Janis Joplin's band. Son of a Preacher Man, Step Inside Love, written by Paul McCartney. Those Were the Days, produced by Paul McCartney. So he's getting around, isn't he? And then you're talking about rock songs, I guess. I thought Sunshine of Your Love was 67, but they've got it 68. And then White Room by Cream. Another great song. The Weight by the band. I could go on, but I mean, pretty awesome.
Hey, let me stop you there.
Sure.
I got to see my dog has to go out here.
Okay, I'll keep the recording on.
Okay, sounds good. Be right back.
Okay. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. If that impression sounds any good, listeners, I'll leave it in. Otherwise, I won't. I'll edit it out. But if I've edited it out, then I don't need to tell you, do I? Because you won't hear me saying that I've edited it out. And you won't hear the impression either. Matt's just slipped away for a minute. Hope you're enjoying it so far. We're roughly about halfway. And we will get to John Lennon soon, I promise. I think in general you do appreciate the fact that we branch off and give you an overview of the year. The John Lennon stuff is pretty crazy.
All right, I am back. We're talking about some music there. I was going to say something. I forget what it was.
I just did my Louis Armstrong impression for the listeners.
What were you saying about the music?
I was just really saying that what an amazing year it was, just for singles. Should we go on to albums?
Oh, the one thing I was going to mention, you get this move to the hard rock. You had Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild, which is one of the biggest songs of the decade, really. Was not number one. Another guy who went kind of hard rock, who normally wouldn't, was Donovan with Hurdy-Gurdy Man, which was co-written actually with George Harrison while they were in India. So these songs were very big hits in the top 40, alongside some of the bubblegum songs like Tighten Up and This Guy's in Love with You by Herb Alpert and Grazing in the Grass. And so it was really quite a mix on the charts, and the likes of which you certainly don't see today.
Yep. All right, albums. We really have to get to John Lennon soon. Do you want to pick a few albums? We'll get on to the White Album when we do the Beatles, John Lennon stuff, so we'll leave that just for now. But
okay. Yeah, as far as albums go, again, we've got the takeoff of FM radio. And this is when album tracks started getting played. So you didn't have these collections of singles on albums as much. You had an album that was a much different listening experience. And you started getting a lot of double albums, like Cream's Wheels of Fire and the Rascals' was a Freedom Suite. Another band, I forget the name, kind of a whitish album came out that year. And so you had a lot of bands stretching out. And this was, with Inagata Devita by Iron Butterfly actually was released very late 68. You had the advent of the album side track, one song that took up a whole album side that band members would stretch out. This became, one of the bad tropes of late 60s music. That just goes to show you where the music was going, stretching out, and that it was getting airplay.
I'll give Pink Floyd a pass with Echoes. I think that was quite worthy.
Yeah, they're a little different. Pink Floyd, I'll give you that.
Oh, and by the way, just very quickly, I don't know if it's still on there, but on YouTube there was a mashup of the Stargate sequence from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out this year, as we mentioned, with Echoes by Pink Floyd. If it's still up there, listeners, have a listen. I'll put it in the show notes. It's absolutely amazing. Of course, it's not intentional. I'm not saying that. It just works, though. It's weird. Right. Again, I'm just going to bosh through a list because, this is just incredible. If I was a music fan in 68, the other point I always like to make is that, remember, these were all on vinyl. They generally all had fairly imaginative album covers. And often they would have instruments on them that we'd never heard before, such as Indian instruments and even classical instruments, or stuff you'd associate with classical music. So I won't be long, but just to go through this list. So the Rolling Stones, Baker's Banquet, the Kinks, Village Green Preservation Society, Velvet Underground, White Light, White Heat. I love that. This was a very lean year for Frank Zappa, only 3 albums this year. We're only in it for the money, and I was saying earlier about he was already parodying Sgt. Pepper. And the album's basically a piss take, as we'd say in England, on hippies.
I was going to say my favorite song of that album, I think it's on that album, Hey Punk, Where You Going With That Flower in Your Hand?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So he's got the Hey Joe reference, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what a genius Zappa was. It takes work to get into it, but once I don't know, it's one of those ones where you have like an aha moment, a eureka moment every now and again. You think, yeah, I'm into this. He had Lumpy Gravy, which was actually a solo album, because the other ones were with the Mothers of Invention. Cruising with Reuben and the Jets, which is a great, quite affectionate doo-wop, but also a bit mocking it as well at the same time. Simon and Garfunkel, Bookends, Jimi Hendrix, Electric Ladyland, The Doors, Waiting for the Sun, The Band, music from Big Pink, The Byrds, The Notorious Bird Brothers, and Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which you covered recently. Pink Floyd, A Saucerful of Secrets, Van Morrison, Astral Weeks, CCR, self-titled album, Neil Young, self-titled, Cream, Wheels of Fire, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Cheap Thrills, Jefferson Airplane, Crown of Creation, Captain Beefheart, Strictly Personal, and The Soft Machine, self-titled. And that's only a few. Wow.
And you're just covering really the FM underground type of bands,
right?
Which those were. And those started to come to the fore, and those are the bands that people still talk about today. You don't get many people bringing out Bobby Goldsboro's album from 1968,
But yeah, again, I'm biased because the 60s for me will always be the greatest music. But just amazing. And on that note, that's the end of part 1, listeners. And we'll be back very soon, Matt and I, with part 2 with the Beatles and John Lennon events. So Matt, thanks for doing this part, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you.